Okay, that was the introduction. Hello, everyone. This is Aaron Goldberg. I'm a pianist. There's no piano in sight, but you'll have to trust me. I am a pianist. Hopefully, some of you know me. Not sure who's out there or who will be out there, but this is my home. This is my bedroom. Down the hallway is my piano, and I don't know. I'll give you a little tour. There's some, fireplace, bookshelf, humidifier. Now we're all feeling at home. So yeah, I was looking forward to chatting with Gail. Luckily, I caught Gail for a second, but I'm realizing that I'm chatting with all of you out there in the virtual world. So I guess I'm going to kind of interview myself, not formally, but in my mind. And I'll just begin by telling everyone a little bit about my history in the music, how I became a jazz musician, how I discovered this amazing music that we all love, and how I came to devote myself to it. So the most important person in my jazz life, in my professional life, was my first jazz teacher, and I think that's true of just so many of us. Most of the American, and I think a lot of the foreign musicians that I know, jazz musicians, started in high school. If you weren't lucky enough to have parents that played, that taught you and passed it down from generation to generation, you most likely started out playing jazz because there was a music teacher in your high school that taught, like a band director, or in my case, he was an amazing bass player who was a math teacher by day and a bass player by night. His name is Bob Sinacrope, and he convinced my high school to let him teach a jazz improvisation class. And you needed zero background in the music. You just needed to play an instrument of some kind. And the summer before the first semester of class, he sent us all a cassette tape. This was the late 80s and days of Maxell tapes. And I had never heard a note of jazz before I received that tape in the mail. And there was a little note attached to it. It said homework for jazz improvisation, first year jazz improvisation. Summer homework, listen to this cassette. That was it. The cassette had about 8 songs on it. So What, Milestones, Cantaloupe Island, Watermelon Man, Moanin', Autumn Leaves, I think Freddie Freeloader, and one more. And I did my homework. I was a good student, even though it was summer. It didn't seem like it would be very difficult homework. I had a Walkman, cassette Walkman, and I spent my entire summer listening to that cassette and falling in love with it, not having any idea what I was listening to. There was a little insert that said the names of the musicians that were playing on each tune. So I knew the names of these musicians, but didn't know who they were. Didn't know that the vast majority of them were Black Americans. I learned a lot just from listening to that cassette. There was no internet, so it wasn't so easy to do research at that point for a 14-year-old. But that was my introduction to not just music, but also, in many respects, African-American culture and improvisation. I was a classical piano student. I can't quite say I was a classical pianist, but I had studied classical piano since I was about 6 or 7 with a teacher, not in a very rigorous way. I wasn't one of those. I didn't have music tiger parents. I did have tiger parents, but they were not music focused. So, playing the piano was just one of many things that I was supposed to do as a well-rounded kid. I played 3 sports in school, and I never imagined that I could possibly become a musician. I never even considered it. I certainly didn't want to be a classical musician because I knew that they had to practice 10, 11, 12 hours a day. And I was pretty much done after 2 hours of Rachmaninoff and Bach. Not that I don't love Rachmaninoff and Bach, but I just didn't have the extreme patience required of a classical musician. And I also didn't have a deep love of the music I was playing at the time. I actually have a much deeper love of classical music now that I've kind of learned some of the principles of great music, that apply across genres. In any case, I was elated to discover this incredible music, and I just could not comprehend how it was improvised. That was just a kind of rumor at that point, as a rumor that this music that you're listening to is actually made up on the spot by these genius musicians, and I had no ability to comprehend that statement. So I kind of sneakily suspected that maybe that was a lie, or there was some kind of trick. Uh, but thank you to Bob Sinecrope, I quickly learned that not only was it true, but it was possible to, for human beings to do such a thing. Of course, it seemed hopelessly impossible for me personally to ever be capable of improvising on a high level, especially given my background in written music. All I knew how to do was translate some notes on a page into sound. So to wean myself off of the paper and to learn to use my ears was a completely new adventure and venture and challenge. And I started from zero. A lot of the other kids in the class had some background playing, in rock bands and improvising a little bit, some blues scale. So I was in no way like the most talented of the kids in the class, but I did fall in love more deeply maybe with the music on that cassette, which of course then opened an incredible door into the entire history of great recorded jazz music. And thanks to Bob, I learned that, okay, if you like one song on this cassette, figure out what album it came from, get the album. And he was, generous enough to let me copy a lot of stuff on the Maxell tapes because I didn't have any money to buy albums at that point. And I made a lot of homemade cassettes with, all the greatest classic albums of all time. I remember that I acquired one of these Jamie Aebersold play along. They weren't actually, I didn't use them for playing along. I just used the book because in the back of the book there was a list of great albums. Thank you to Jamie Aebersold for that list. And I just tried to acquire as many of those great albums as I could. And I also quickly learned the principle that if you love listening to Miles, let's say Milestones or Kind of Blue, you're going to probably love listening to the albums made by the guys that play on those great albums. So soon I was listening to Red Garland Trio, and I was listening to John Coltrane, and I was listening to Wynton Kelly, and I was listening to, Paul Chambers and Bill Evans and Cannonball Adderley, and then the Herbie Hancock later, and then the door opened, Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers, and I was hooked. So I was hooked in two ways. I fell in love with the music, the soulfulness of it, and the extraordinary artistry of the improvisers, and that it made me feel good and made me want to move, and yet it gave me an inner sense of calm as well. And I also fell in love with the challenge of trying to become a better improviser, starting at zero. And thanks to Bob Sinecrope, I learned, the basic principles of how to teach yourself. And these are very much the same principles that I think, Charlie Parker and Miles and Louis Armstrong and Coltrane used to become the great geniuses that they were. It's an oral tradition. You need to learn it by ear, same way you learn a spoken language. And that was very, very difficult for me, but I realized it got easier the more I did it. So the more I used my ears, the more my ears were trained, the quicker I was able to learn some vocabulary and some songs. And the quicker I was able to sound like a, slightly more advanced beginner. Anyway, jazz improvisation quickly became my favorite class. I continued this class for the next 3 years of high school. And of course, I still had no idea that it was possible to become a professional jazz musician, but I did spend more time doing it. I kind of stopped playing classical music for a while, and I just focused on jazz. But I had all my other homework to do. I was playing a bunch of other sports. I was into writing poetry, and I was still juggling. Finally, I graduated high school. I was a little bit younger than my classmates, and I thought, I don't want to go to liberal arts college and get on a train that was taking me somewhere that my parents imagined that I might go. closer to the, paths that they have trod themselves. I wanted to try to figure out how I could tread my own path and chart my own destiny, so to speak. And I had no idea how that was possible, but I knew that if I, went immediately to university, I might end up on somebody else's, living somebody else's version of my life. So long story short, I took a year and I went to the new school. That there's a very long story in there, because my family was not supportive of this idea of my moving to New York when I was 17 and enrolling at the new school. But I did it, and I met some incredible musicians in that 1991-92 year, fellow students, people that I still play with today. Omer Avital was a student. We still play together today. That first year, Adam Cruz was a student. Brad Meldau was a student. Roy Hargrove was a student. And there were a lot of other great musicians that were just hanging out at the new school, using the facilities to practice and play sessions and rehearse, including Joshua Redman and Leon Parker and Mark Turner. And, I developed some associations that very first year in New York when I was still really young. I didn't have any gigs. I wasn't, playing on a very high level, but I was going out to hear Cedar Walton, Kenny Barron, Mulgrew Miller every night at Bradley's. And that was, in retrospect, that was a magical time in New York City, in Greenwich Village. I lived on 8th Street between 6th and University and 5th and 6th. And then it was just incredible. You could choose, which masters to go out and hear. Do I want to go hear Freddie Hubbard here at Sweet Basil? Do I want to go hear Joe Henderson at Fat Tuesdays? Do I want to go hear, Cedar at Bradley's? Or maybe I'll try to do all three and, run out of money, or maybe the doorman will let me in if he recognizes me. So, I was out till 3, 4 in the morning listening to the masters. And I think that's also how the masters themselves learned, going out to hear their favorite cats when they were young. And I took some lessons, and I tried to play as much as I could. And I got better. And for the first time in my life, I was focusing on my music, on one thing. And when you put, all your energy and effort and mental acuity into one thing and practice time, you will improve. So I did improve enough to play some gigs by the end of my year at the new school. And then I ran out of money and I left. I basically made a deal with my parents, and I realized about halfway through that year of music school that, Coltrane and Miles and Mulgrew and Herbie, like they hadn't necessarily gone to jazz school, right? Or Chick, there were no jazz schools back, when Chick and Herbie were coming up, let alone when Miles and Coltrane and Cannonball were coming up. And they got to the extraordinary level that they got to just learning orally. And I kind of realized I already knew how to learn. And what I needed was a community of great musicians to inspire me. And I had already discovered that community. So I realized I didn't have to go to jazz school in order to become a jazz musician. And I also noticed that some of the best students at the new school never went to class. Should I name names? Well, yeah, I mean, like Roy and Brad, like I didn't see them very much in class. Roy would pop in, play a few solos in an ensemble and leave. He was playing every night. He didn't need to go to class, of course. So what I realized was I needed to play, and I needed to keep, studying the tradition, and also like exploring, just improvising. The more you speak a language, the more eloquent, hopefully, you get at it. The more fluent, at least, you get. So I realized I could go anywhere. I could study anything as long as I had a community of musicians to play with and to challenge me. And I knew, if I needed teachers, I could go to the albums. I could study with McCoy Tyner, checking out, the real McCoy. McCoy's my teacher for this week. Next week, Freddie Hubbard is my teacher. So I did. I went to Harvard. I studied philosophy and psychology, kind of mixed together into an interdisciplinary concentration they called mind, brain, and behavior. I discovered that I love philosophy. I love studying analytic philosophy. It is about as far away from jazz as possible in many respects. both are extremely challenging, and I relish the challenge of both. And I think both prioritize clear thinking and listening, understanding. There are some points of intersection, but basically, one is entirely in the moment. Jazz teaches you, Zen principles of how to live in the moment and enjoy every moment. And analytic philosophy is all about rigorously going over and over and over the same ideas until you tease out the error or identify, the solution. So yeah, they turned into a nice balance. I spent many, many nights at Wallies Cafe, this amazing club in Boston, playing with some of my dearest friends, Reuben Rogers and Jimmy Green, Darren Barrett. Jeremy Pelt was in the band for a while. John Lampkin was the drummer. When I first came, Adonis Rose was playing, and Melvin Butler. Developed a lot of great friendships through Wallies. I owe Wallies Cafe a lot. I grew a lot from those gigs. They were paying $15 for a 5-hour gig when I first did the gig with Teodros Avery. It was probably 1992 or 90, maybe 92 or 90, early 93. $15 for 5 hours. That's definitely below minimum wage, but we didn't care because we just wanted to play. And eventually went up to $50. That was an enormous raise we got. Might have been at the time a little bit above minimum wage. So that became my scene. Boston, my jazz scene moved from New York to Boston during the school year, and then I went back to New York in the summertime and reconnected with my new school friends and tried to play as much as I could in the city in the summer. Around that period, I met Betty Carter. I got extremely fortunate. Melvin Butler, who I mentioned, a great tenor player who plays with Brian Blade's band, he sent Betty a cassette that I happened to be playing on, and Betty invited the whole band to come participate in what was a workshop, a week-long workshop culminating in a couple of concerts at the Brooklyn Academy of Music, which she decided to call Jazz Ahead. That was the first year of Betty Carter's Jazz Ahead, which is still in existence, sadly without Betty. But I, like so many other musicians at the time, and going back in history, had the great fortune of studying at the University of Betty Carter and getting my ass handed to me, as they say, night after night by Betty. Forced to, rise to the challenge, forced to overcome my sense of intimidation and, questioning my own belonging in that kind of situation, playing with guys that I heard on records like Greg Hutchinson and, Brian Blade and Clarence Penn. So I grew from that. You grow from the challenge, you grow from getting pushed and playing with musicians that were better than you. So I did another juggling act for a couple of years between school and music, and then I also had a chance, I should mention, to study with Jerry Bergonzi. So Jerry is an incredible teacher. I owe him a lot too. He kind of took me to that next level. I spent my sort of part of my senior year of high school and then my first year of Harvard studying with Jerry, and playing, and then eventually playing in his band. So I learned a ton from that. I also got to play with the great Bill Pierce. So I did have a short tenure in some Boston bands, and then I moved back to New York in the end of '96, and that's when I met Gail Boyd and Mr. Gregory Tardy, who was playing in Elvin Jones's band at the time. And Greg gave me one of my first gigs when I came back to New York. He was signed to Impulse Records at the time, and I played on his first Impulse album, on half the album, and my hero Mulgrew Miller played on the other half. That was definitely a stepping stone for me, to realize my job was to be myself and play as best as I could and make a contribution to the music alongside people that I idolized. And that made me really feel like this is possible. It is possible to make a living in this music and to make an artistic contribution to this music. So I owe all those early relationships a lot, and the people that I started playing with in those early years, early 90s, both at the new school and while I was in college, those are still some of the people I play with today. Most of the people I play with today are people that I met in the early 90s, or mid 90s. So Ruben Rogers, we started school at the same time. He was going to Berkeley and I was going to Harvard. We met in a recording studio at 3 a.m. My favorite story, his hands were bleeding as he was playing because he had just picked up acoustic bass. He'd been only an electric player in St. Thomas, and we kind of took a musical liking to each other, and we're still tight today. Matt Penman, another guy I met in the early 90s, still play with today. Jimmy Green, I mentioned. John Ellis, I met slightly later in the mid 90s. Joshua Redman and Mark Turner, I met them also in the mid 90s. I played in both of their bands for a long time. So yeah, I mean, I always say this to young musicians: your community is going to stay your community. Your generation is going to inspire you for life. And I feel like I've learned as much from people like Mark, Joshua, Omer Avital, Eric Harland, Gregory Hutchinson, as I have from the great masters. And those are also my friends, my community. I love them. I love I love my musical friends. Greg talks about it like a marriage. You get in a band like Josh Redman's quartet or my trio, we've been together 25 years. I mean, on and off, right? I've been playing with these guys for 25 years. So it's like a marriage, and we have some rough times, but mostly good times. Probably the reason it's 98% good times is that we don't all live together. But yeah, the love gets deeper over the years. So yeah, I mean, I had a lot of long, wonderful, relationships, collaborations with some of the people I mentioned, as well as Kurt Rosenwinkel for a couple of years, and Wynton Marsalis and Lincoln Center Jazz Orchestra for a year. I also had some, short-lived magical moments playing with some of my heroes, like Freddie Hubbard and Al Foster. Actually, I had a 4 or 5 year tenure in Al Foster's band. Betty, of course, and yeah, and I guess at some point I realized that I wanted to lead my own trio. That was probably in the late 90s, around 97. I formed a trio with Ruben and Eric Harland. I met Eric playing with Greg Tardy, and I had a feeling that was going to be a nice combination, and I was right. And we stayed together pretty much all the way up till 2015. And then I formed a new trio with the guy that I first met again back in 1992. I think I played maybe my first gig in New York with him, Mr. Leon Parker, who I love to go hear at the Village Gate with Jackie Terrison and Tom Harrell and Kenny Barron. Anyway, I started a new trio with Leon and Matt Penman. And we recently went back in the studio with Eric and Ruben, so that trio may be reincarnated in the near future. I also formed a collaborative trio with Omer Avital and Ali Jackson, another guy I met in the early 90s. Actually, I met him on the first day of my audition for Manhattan School of Music. I ended up going to New School, but I met Ali, was playing with his cousin Carlos McKinney, and we all kind of bonded listening to each other's auditions when we were 17. And we stayed in touch, and we have a collaborative trio called the Yes Trio with Omer and Ali. So my projects have been, long-standing in general. My musical relationships have been long-standing, and I have more recently tried to start hiring some younger musicians because, the tradition needs to be passed along as it was passed along to me, and I learned from the masters. I want to do my part, and it's always a joy. Every week I try to bring some younger musicians over to my house to play. 2-3 times a week I have sessions here in the room with the piano on the other side of the apartment. And that's how I got better myself. When I first came to New York, I had no gigs, even though though I knew some people, I had very few gigs, let's put it like that. And how I met musicians was just having sessions, meeting people, inviting them over. Luckily, I knew that I needed to have a place to play. I had a piano and I bought a drum set, and I made sure my neighbors weren't going to kill me. I chose a place where I knew that I could play music. And that's, some of the most important advice I can give to young musicians. Besides, stay close to your friends and your generation. The other is make sure that you live in a place where you can play, because, this language needs to be spoken. We're not living in a decade where you can play 3-4 gigs a night. Charlie Parker's generation, if you grew up in New York City, or you moved to New York City in the 1950s, you might be able to play gigs starting in the afternoon, going all the way till 4 a.m. Those days are long gone. So, there's a reason that generation of musicians was so phenomenal. There's probably many reasons, but one of the reasons was the amount of work that they had. And so we need to make up for that fact that we don't have as much work by just playing as much as we can with each other. And I discovered that during the pandemic. I was almost as happy as I had been before the pandemic, touring and playing for concert audiences, just from inviting musicians over to play, even wearing masks. At first, I would just invite one musician and we'd play a masked session, just play some tunes. And that feeling of improvising together with somebody, finding a groove together, listening closely to each other, responding and conversing, and practicing our art and our craft, and just practicing creativity, right? That's the ultimate, living in the moment kind of opportunity. It's almost as good without an audience. And I often, think that I would do this, even if I didn't get paid for it, although I wouldn't have an apartment to live in, but or to play sessions in. So I spent most of my pandemic practicing for the first few months when it wasn't safe to really relate, to see people, and then, taking the small calculated risk that I wanted to see my friends, my musical friends, and having sessions at my place. I didn't feel any need to really, connect with audiences out there in the virtual world. I was kind of content to work on my music at home with my friends. And I actually needed a break from touring. One thing that has been magical about my career is that I, starting in 97, I started to tour, and I started working with some bands. At the time, Joshua Redman was playing 250, 300, being on, well, let's say he was on the road 250, 300 days out of the year. So we would go, and time would pass like that. I got to see the world. I mean, I've been to 90 something countries, but I didn't get to come home and rest. And it just kind of moved on from there. So I felt like I'd spent the last 25 years on the move, or 23 years when the pandemic hit, and I needed a break. And it was a horrible time for all of us, and there was so much suffering, and we lost so many masters of the music and friends and relatives. But for me personally, the pause came at the perfect time. So I really needed that pause. And also, that was the end of Trump's 4 years. The election was coming. I felt like it was time to try to focus on, socio-political side of our lives, and give myself to that. So I really felt like pandemic came at the right moment for me. It's a terrible thing. And now I feel like it's time to restart. I treasure every gig that I have now. You realize how much you took for granted. I feel like I tried to stay aware of how lucky we all were to be working that much. But of course, you really feel it when you're not working and not making money, not traveling, not touring, not seeing your friends as much as you would. And so as things have started to pick up now, and it feels like this variant is not as, mortal, it's not as deadly, and therefore should not be as fear-inducing as the prior ones. I feel it's really important for us to kind of adjust and get back into what we do, which is, play music for people. And it's been amazing to see clubs packed again, and people are hungry for live music, which is good news for all of us. So yeah, I took a few notes. Oh, is it 5:30 already? Wow, that's amazing. I talked for a long time. Should I stop? Yeah, is it time to stop? I guess I covered everything.
You can finish your thought if you have it.
No, I didn't have any. I was actually just thinking like I should look at this list of topics that I might want to discuss. So I guess I discussed them all. Maybe there are any questions in the comments or chat. Okay, just some comments. Okay, well, that was fast. It's like going on the road. You just time flies when you're having fun. Thanks for listening, and I hope to see you all in a club or at a festival very soon. Stay safe, and thanks again.